Okay, let's get back here. So everything we've set up to now applies generally to plant biotechnology in the broad sense. In other words, just at the level of varieties and breeding without recourse to the manipulation of genes and DNA. But the story from there cannot avoid the subject of genetic engineering in the more narrow and technical sense. And Kloppenberg is concerned to explain the importance of this new kind of technological innovation and power to the discussion that he has laid out thus far. So a couple of landmarks in this. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick specify the structure of DNA. And there's some small print here, sequences of pairs of 4 different nucleotide bases that code for the production of amino acids, which combine to form proteins from which organisms are constructed. If you want more details about that, ask Nathan. It is a common chemical language, so to speak, for all biological life, plants and animals alike, microorganisms, and it provided this breakthrough, provided the potential of taking these genetic pairs apart and putting them back together in different ways. So it no longer was a question of just taking this plant and that plant with visible traits that we wanted to perpetuate or accentuate and bring them together and seeing what happens. It was now possible, at least in theory, to actually take apart the genetic makeup of that plant and pull out some gene sequences related to a given trait and insert them into some other set of DNA. And this is where you start hearing about, the sort of Frankenfoods type of scenarios in which, a gene from a fish can be spliced into the genetic constitution of a tomato plant such that the tomatoes have some trait that is desirable, right? And I mean, the list of potential applications is essentially infinite, right? What if it turns out that there's a little sequence of genes that will make tomatoes grow faster at a uniform rate and end up shaped like cubes so that they can be boxed without wasted space, and they don't soften or go bad when boxed up like that, and they can last for 3 weeks as you transport them around the world, and then magically they will suddenly turn ripe at the same moment. And it may be that, it's a salmon somewhere that has that sequence that will impart that kind of amazing capacity on tomatoes. Why are you laughing? What's funny about that? Anyway, so this is the moment at which this language of life, DNA, comes to be known to science and is potentially controllable. It took 20 years, however, before Stanley Cohen and Herbert Boyer spliced the DNA sequence from one organism into an E. coli bacterium, demonstrating that you could, in fact, move genes around between species or even between genera. In other words, from one kingdom of life to another, and have it actually reproduce, right? Have the organism itself be able to reproduce and have the offspring contain the genetic sequence that you put in it. And this is not simple stuff. This is extraordinarily complicated, and it takes decades to achieve what might seem like fairly small steps, but they are potentially of huge significance. Okay, no. This technology is applicable, according to Kloppenberg, to some 70% of the U.S. economy as a whole, right? It's not limited to agriculture. It has implications for medicine, engineering, industry, waste, energy, you name it. Continued increases in agricultural productivity, says Kloppenberg, may depend almost entirely on genetic engineering. And this technology could increase or decrease a whole variety of environmental ills and problems, such as fertilizer use, depending on how the technology is used and explored. In theory, you might use this tool to develop, say, corn or wheat that doesn't need as much artificial fertilizer applied to it. And that might be a great thing from an environmental point of view, right? Because as we've seen, nitrogen loading and the excess use of artificial fertilizers is an enormous environmental problem. Second only to climate change, perhaps, according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So if you could come up with genetic engineering solutions that would allow that kind of thing, it might be a great thing for the environment. You might have trouble getting such a thing out there and widespread because you might run into a lot of resistance from the fertilizer industry, right? So there are hundreds of millions, billions of dollars at stake in these potential innovations. Kloppenberg describes that the ways in which this innovation has informed and in many ways required that the division of labor in agricultural research change yet again, right? So he described earlier a division of labor in which the public sector, the land-grant universities, did this research and distributed the seeds for free. And that more or less meant that private seed companies had no opening, had no reason to be, and didn't exist. Over time, he described with hybrid corn, the division of labor shifted, and the public sector conducted so-called basic research, and then turned over the products of that basic research to the private sector, and the private sector could then use those products in the pursuit of private production and profit, right? Take the 2 strains of corn and hybridize them, and the seed that you can produce is then your property and can build a seed industry in corn. And indeed, it did do that. Well, the distinction between basic research that would be done in universities at public expense and applied research that would figure out how to make money from the products has necessarily sort of proven obsolete in the face of genetic engineering. Precisely because biotechnology at this level requires an integration across a wide variety of not only fields within universities, but also dimensions of the industrial sector as well. So you need to bring together molecular biology, plant breeding, testing, and product development. You must coordinate with all kinds of other inputs, such as fertilizers, and with the food processing sector. So these innovations suddenly blur the line between basic and applied and make the old division of labor no longer appropriate. He describes how chemical conglomerates, acting on these breakthroughs and anticipating future opportunities, began to acquire firms in the food industry and in seed production. So companies that had previously been in the chemical sector started to buy seed companies and started to integrate with the food industry, investing heavily in research as well, directly or through contracts with universities and other research entities. He describes professors joining with joint venture capital to start new biotechnology firms. The lines between basic and applied became blurred because every breakthrough in how genes work and how to manipulate them can translate quickly into commodities, right? You figure out how to get that gene sequence from a salmon into a tomato, and that's maybe a basic breakthrough, but it has immediate application for commodity production. And so this makes it a little bit more complicated to figure out, how much of this research should be paid for by the public through universities, because it's in the public interest, and how much of it really the cost should be borne by private industry. And the lines get blurred, and this is very much this is a story with great relevance right here on campus over the last, say, 30 years. So there have been continued efforts to keep public sector institutions out of the competitive commodity aspects of the industry, to limit the activities of public sector institutions to things like cataloging, collecting, banking germplasm, and not allow the public to be the owner of research into things that might be profitable. Now, or another way of putting it is, take the public institutions, such as universities, public universities, and sort of get them to work on a model of patenting and private accumulation rather than a model of simply doing the research and then putting it out there for anybody to use, right? So contracts can get signed in which a private entity, a corporation, or a startup helps to fund some research at a university, and the products of that research are already contractually proprietary, right? And the funding entity, the corporation, or whoever put the money up for the research, basically has claimed ahead of time the ownership of whatever products are developed from the research. And the fact that it took place in a public university or drew in any way on public funds does not change that patentable private relationship. So the idea is to get the government to do the kind of cataloging and everything that might not lend itself directly to money making, and then let the private sector take over from there. And this is taking place in a context in which third world nations still harbor much of the diversity that might be useful for genetic engineering, particularly in tropical plants. And this is where you start getting these very complicated arrangements between researchers and, say, indigenous tribes, sometimes mediated by nonprofit groups, trying to figure out the intellectual property rights or other kinds of property rights related to this research. So Kloppenberg has a fairly simple conclusion with respect to this, what we should do, how we should. He doesn't take, as much as his analysis itself seems to be sort of stringently Marxist, he doesn't take, at the end of the day, a stringently Marxist stance on what should be done. He's clearly critical of the privatization of research, but he does not condemn genetic engineering as a whole. He sees it simply as an innovation, a tool, a technology that now exists and may or may not be of benefit to the sort of public at large or humankind. He sees enormous risks and enormous opportunities. And I'm sure you've heard about some of these risks. And the loss of genetic erosion is one risk. But the risk to farmers' livelihoods in the third world is another risk. There's also possibilities of genetic material getting out there and reproducing in nature in ways that we can't predict or control. And you might suddenly end up with some kind of super pest that we have no way of keeping up with, or it's very expensive to control. Those risks are real, even if in most cases, statistically speaking, probabilistically speaking, they may be small. There is a potential for less reliance on chemicals. There's a potential for increases in food quality or quantity, and there's a potential for efficiencies of various kinds. Kloppenberg is quite clear. This is how we should expect to increase agricultural productivity going forward. The question, he says, is who will decide what gets studied, what kinds of products get developed, and how the returns are distributed. In other words, the question is politics. He's quite unequivocal about this. He wants to know, will the profit motive be the fundamental force in answering these questions? In other words, will it continue to be the case that at the end of the day, the private profit-seeking interests are the most powerful ones and set the terms for research and development with respect to agriculture and specifically genetic engineering? For him, this is the fundamental question. And I don't know if I mentioned it before, but it is worth noting that the arguments for preserving biological diversity, which I believe are powerful arguments, are orders of magnitude more powerful with respect to agricultural diversity, agricultural genetic diversity, than they are for so-called sort of wild diversity. The narrowing down of the genetic basis of the plants and animals that we rely on for food is much further progressed than the narrowing down of the genetic diversity of all the other plants and animals and insects and so forth in the world. If there is urgency, it is much, much, much more urgent in agriculture than it is in, say, wilderness areas. So ecological imperialism wasn't only ecological. That's one concluding thought you can draw from this. If you've taken Geography 10 and thought about Alfred Crosby or Jared Diamond, the notion that somehow the ecological differences between the New World and the Old World were determinative potentially overlooks the important role of human activities in both places in shaping the underlying ecological basis of agriculture itself. In other words, the varieties of plants on which agriculture rests are not simply given by nature, but are the result of millennia of human decisions and activities related to planting and replanting crops, breeding animals, and controlling those reproductive moments. And it's not a situation where you can simply say, well, the Old World somehow conquered the New World on the basis of some crops, right? Which is a kind of simplistic reading of Diamond or Crosby, right? It's worth asking how Kloppenberg's geographical categories affect his analyses and conclusions. I've already mentioned this briefly. The way you divide up the world into first world and third world, for instance, old world versus new, can have significant implications for the kinds of conclusions that you reach regarding the relative contributions of different parts of the world or different peoples to the larger public makeup or makeup of public, the public interest in agriculture. And then finally, that which is free cannot be commodified. And it's an interesting principle, perhaps, that comes out of Kloppenberg's story. For as long as the government provided seed for free and collected seed from around the world and developed varieties that were well suited to different parts of the country and provided them for free, it was not possible for the seed to be commodified. And if we generalize from that, we might say that which is free cannot be commodified. We might compare public seed distribution in the United States before World War II with the poor laws. If you provide bread for free to everyone, can bread be commodified? Well, in a sense, no. And if the public, the government, the state, plays that role, it is directly impinging on or inhibiting the scope and power of the private markets, right? The private sector market. And finally, if so, how does state provisioning of anything compare to natural capital providing ecosystem services? What might internalizing the costs actually mean? If we can, this would be the stringent Marxist prescription, right? You nationalize all of this stuff. You make it public in the sense that the government owns it, the government provides it independently of cost or market considerations, such that certain things like water quality or even the diversity of plants in the lands around us are provided for free. and therefore cannot be commodified. The alternative vision of the natural capital proponents, imagining that these things can all be somehow captured within, encompassed or enclosed, and then internalize all the costs, is a radical alternative to this, and it runs up against some interesting conceptual questions about whether this is even possible. Are there any questions? So for Thursday, if you can finish the 2 chapters in Connolly that we asked you to read for today and Thursday. Thank you.